To the Point with Michael Williams.
Good morning. Former President Donald Trump reacts from Mar-a-Lago to appointment of a special counsel as his potential legal troubles mount. We'll look at that developing story later in the broadcast during our roundtable. But first, snapshots of the changing Florida vote and the issues that drove your vote. My first guest this morning, Dr. Kevin Wagner, chairman of the Political Science Department at Florida Atlantic University. And we began with this look at the midterms and the brewing competition between Mr. Trump and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis.
Florida differed from the rest of the nation. You know, midterm elections are usually a product of a referendum on the president. They are people surge to vote for in the presidency, and the midterms they stay home a little bit, and you usually see the president do relatively poorly. In much of the country, in places like Pennsylvania, the surge actually sustained itself. You saw Democrats actually turn out in places like Pennsylvania and even in Georgia. In Florida, we saw a more traditional pattern. We saw a lot of the president's supporters actually stay home. And we saw that in the demographics and women, in how the Democrats voted, and it made a big gap.
There was a very interesting article, how Florida turned red, changing population, weak opposition, aggressive Governor Ron DeSantis, the USA Today Network, Palm Beach Post. Does that sort of sum it up in your mind and break down a little more of how we turned red? Because we used to call it a purple state, and our friend Brian Crowley, who'll be along shortly, has been saying to me for years, I don't think we're purple anymore. This seemed to validate that with an exclamation mark.
Well, there are still a lot of Democrats that live in the state, but one of the things, I mean, at some point you have to accept the reality of how the elections are going, and it's been a long time since you've had really competitive statewide elections where Democrats are really competing, other than Nikki Fried briefly, and of course you had Bill Nelson as senator, but you have to go back to Lawton Childs as governor, so it's been a relatively long time since they've been competitive. I think one of the things that stood out to me in looking at the exit polls in Florida in the midterm was how demoralized the Democrats appear to be. As a percentage of the electorate, they're down. As a party, they don't seem to be able to turn out the vote. If they could, they could be competitive. But one of the truths is they haven't been, and they haven't been for a while.
To that point, the same article that I've quoted, and I'll quote it several more times, said only 52% of Democratic voters cast ballots compared to 67% of Republican voters, speaking to that voter enthusiasm or lack therein.
Yeah, the Democrats can't seem to get their vote out. It's a product of game. It might be a product of their ground game. It might be a product of their resources. It might be a product of their candidates and not getting their voters excited. But even if you look between 20 and 22, and 20 was not a great year for Democrats either, but even between 20 and 22, you can see the Democratic share of the electorate actually declining pretty substantially, almost 7 points.
How are the demographics changing in Florida? Everybody has their guess. Influx of voters tending to be more Republican, fresh to the state, increase in the Hispanic vote starting to tilt more Republican, older voters that already tended to that way. Do you subscribe to those analyses? And if you do or don't, your thoughts, and what do you add to that? What are you seeing as you crunch the numbers?
Yeah, I think there is some evidence of growing Republican strength. In other words, more people enthusiastic about the Republican Party. But I think the real driver here is just the failure of the Democratic Party to generate any enthusiasm among their voters and any real push among their voters to get out. I mean, one of the things that struck me is if you looked at the age breakdown of the voters, 18 to 29 is where Charlie Crist did the best, but as a proportion of the electorate, they're actually down. Almost half of the electorate is over 50 in this particular election, and it suggests to me that there's a lot of young voters. There's opportunity for the Democratic Party because there's a lot of young voters that could participate, but they're choosing not to, and I think that's really hurting them.
This same Palm Beach Post USA Today article said something interesting. You and I've talked about this. Between a fourth and a third of the electorate now is registered no party affiliation, and I think the easy assumption some of us in the media make is that those voters are sitting there saying, I'm going to look at everything, all sides, I don't tilt this way or that. Susan McManus, a political science professor who you know from the University of South Florida, does great work. Now, she looked at the numbers. Over the past 2 years, this article said, more than 500,000 voters, registered voters, changed their party affiliation or opted for no party affiliation. You say, wow, that's a lot. They're going to sit there and say, which way do I go? But she said she conducted research and found Republicans gained the most from that. Party switchers and ditchers, she called them. So it's not necessarily they're sitting there with this Solomonic decision. They already tended to tilt Republican even if they were in PA registration. Does your research and your sense of things back that up?
Yeah, the category of independent actually covers a wide range of different types of voters. It covers the voters that are independent because they don't pay a lot of attention to politics, so when they're asked which party in there, they don't really know and they can't choose. It covers the one that we often think it is, which is people that actually are independent and they try to make a choice in each election. But a good chunk of them are what we call independent leaners, which are people that already tend to go one way or the other. They tend to either be Democratic or they tend to be either Republican, and they tend to be pretty consistent partisan voters. They just don't want to be identified that way because they, for whatever reason, they think they want to be considered as independent. The difficulty sometimes is in measuring and differentiating between those groups. Democrats traditionally thought they would do better in those groups because a lot of that group also it's not just people that aren't sure. A lot of young people, when they register to vote, often register as independent or no party affiliation, which is the way we do it here in Florida, and they do tend to lean a little more Democratic. So it can be mixed depending on which part of the group you're talking about.
Numbers are driven, presumably, by how people feel on a wide range of issues, and the governor ran hard on anger or angst over COVID and lockdowns. He fought to keep Florida from being locked down as a culture warrior. How are those things playing? As you look at numbers, as you look at issues, what do you see and sense there? Clearly, it was a winning formula for him across the board.
Yeah, I
in
think,
a historic way, I might add.
Yeah, the thing that really actually, putting that all aside for a second, which is I know is going to be kind of ironic, when I look at the exit polls, the number that jumps out to me is the concern about inflation.
Okay.
People were very concerned about inflation, and about 3/4 of them voted for Governor DeSantis, suggesting that the economic issues were really primarily driving a lot of this. What is interesting to me is that in assessing that inflation was bad and they were concerned about it and choosing the governor, they put the blame of that inflation essentially on the federal government and not on the state government. And that shows a pretty effective campaign by Governor DeSantis.
To tie Charlie Crist to Joe Biden, right. President Joe Biden.
And to sort of put the onus of that, because some people could have held the state government somewhat responsible for it, but these numbers suggest that when they were angry about inflation, they were not angry at Governor DeSantis.
What else are you seeing as you dig through numbers? I know you love to dive into them and sort of read the political tea leaves. What are you seeing?
The abortion issue struck me as pretty interesting in Florida for a couple of reasons. There was a belief that might drive out a lot of Democratic turnout. That didn't turn out to be the case. It certainly didn't drive up the young voters' numbers. What is interesting to me is about a majority of Floridians suggested that they were at least dissatisfied with the Dobbs decision. But what is interesting to me about that particular number is Governor DeSantis won about 1/3 of them, suggesting that either they didn't value the issue more than the other issues that were important to them, or they don't believe that Governor DeSantis is going to do some of the things that were claimed in the Charlie Crist ads.
As we look ahead to a Trump potential DeSantis clash, any early signs of what Floridians, let me rephrase that, we're already seeing some early polling on that, but as you look at the signs and we look more deeply into 23 and then to 24, what do the numbers tell you about how that clash may play out, at least in this pivotal battleground state?
Yeah, very difficult one to predict. One of the things that is interesting is that a good amount of the support for Governor DeSantis were Trump supporters. That's what came out in the exit poll, that they were voting for DeSantis to be supportive of the former president. So, and about 20% of that looked like it was President Trump supporters. If they are on opposite sides of a ballot, if you have to choose, it's not a really good indicator which one they would choose.
Would you caution against what has been a lot of loud voices in the last couple of weeks and the new, at least temporary conventional wisdom that the Republican Party wants to move on from Trump and that DeSantis or another bevy of younger candidates can seize the day? That seems to be the narrative at the moment. What's your cautionary note?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is the president's support among Republicans is still high. Recent surveys have him about 80% support among Republicans. So to suggest that he doesn't have support in the Republican Party, I think is premature. Additionally, the campaign hasn't even begun to start. You haven't seen them compete against each other. So I think we're trying to draw tea leaves from a race that hasn't even started.
What would your message be if the Democratic Party of Florida, which admits we've had them sit here and say, we're lost in the wilderness, we're not sitting there gauging the issues that are driving Floridians, what would your message be to them?
They got to start building party organization, I think, more effectively. I mean, one of the things the Republican Party has done really well is do outreach and ground game in places where they haven't traditionally done as well. And so you've seen that advantage, or at least the progress they've made among Latino voters in particular. The Democratic Party seems under-resourced. It doesn't seem to have the ground game, doesn't seem to have the outreach. And you got to start from the beginning and start working at getting a party that works in the grassroots.
And what would your message be to the Republican Party in Florida? They've got a supermajority in the Florida House and Florida Senate now. Obviously, Governor had an historic victory. The old saying, pride goeth before the fall. They're at the apex of power. What would you say to them about what they're going to have to do to sustain it and what they need to watch out for to make sure that they're not at the commanding height and won't be there again?
What the patterns in history and political science tell us is that it's at the apex that parties often overreach. That's when they make mistakes, they go too far away from their base voters, or they adopt policies that are relatively unpopular, and then they provide the opening for the other party to come back in. It's inevitable, it almost universally happens. You know, the strength of the Republican Party has been in here and is identifying the issues that are important, like inflation, and focusing on those. The farther they get away from those issues that Floridians are focused on, the more danger they would be that the Democratic Party could make a comeback.
Did we see some of that in the national numbers where it seemed that a lot of Americans were saying, we don't want to hear any more about discredited claims about the 2020 election. We're worried about pocketbook issues. We're worried about other things. How do you look at the national picture of what happened and perhaps to do something about Florida? That and your closing comments?
Yeah, I think we did see it in some places. We especially saw it in Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, where Republicans running on sort of pocketbook issues did particularly well. And in the same states, in the same environments, Republicans that ran on the more divisive issues didn't do quite as well. I think that's a warning for Democrats, too, to focus on those issues that are relevant to voters.
What is some last thoughts that we haven't touched on that you think are particularly pertinent as you close out, as always, your analysis, which we appreciate?
Yeah, you know, we spent a while with Florida being sort of the focal point of the electoral process because of the former president being here. I think one of the things, you know, that many of us were looking forward to was studying the elections from not being at the center of it. But I think we're due for another 4 years of Florida being the focal point of the election, where the strong candidates are, where the money is, and where the race is going to be decided.
Good. It'll give us plenty more opportunities to sit and talk as you parse what you're seeing with polling attitudes and what the voters ultimately are saying. Dr. Kevin Wagner, Florida Atlantic University, head of their political science department, thank you, and happy Thanksgiving to you and yours.
You too.
And up next, Brian Crowley at our roundtable. Up next, a special counsel appointed. The former president reacts. Our roundtable next.